The Chicago City Council just ushered in sweeping change when it voted to abolish the subminimum wage. Now, will this change impact our hospitality industry, and how will those changes work? What will it mean for those of us who like to go to restaurants? I'm Andrea Zopp. This is Chicago Newsroom 2.0, and we'll get into it all on the other side of the break. Stay with us.
I'm Ugavalta, host of 3 Questions With. There is an urgent need to increase the number of judges who have spent their careers representing underserved populations. One candidate that the Cook County Democratic Party did endorse is Judge James Murphy Aguilu.
Appellate court justices, you're still looking at percentages that are not representative of our community.
Join us on Wednesdays at 7:30 in the evening via Channel 19, streaming on cantv.org and the CanTV Plus app.
Big news for workers in Chicago's hospitality industry. We're going to talk about the reforms and their impact later during our roundtable. But first, we're going to look at another significant challenge in our city, maternal and infant health. According to a 2021 health report released by the Chicago Department of Public Health, the infant mortality rate for Black babies is nearly 3 times as high as the mortality rate for that of non-Black children. And nationwide, Black women are far more likely to lose their lives during childbirth than their white counterparts, which undoubtedly sets the stage for a maternal health crisis in the Black community. So what can be done about it? Well, that's where today's first guest comes in. She's a senior program manager at Start Early, a Chicago-based nonprofit working to advance quality early childhood learning and care. And she's here to explain how Start Early works to improve health outcomes for Black mothers and babies. Please help me welcome to the program Mary Towers. Mary, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with some of the terms I used in the opening and make sure that my audience is level set. What is, when we talk about a maternal health crisis, what does that mean to you at Start Early?
Okay, well, first of all, when we're referring to maternal health, we're talking about the health of a woman during pregnancy, during labor and delivery, and then afterwards, up until the first year of the child's existence. And when we think about this maternal and infant health crisis, it is not only a public health crisis, it's a unacceptable public health condition. And when we think about some of those stats that you stated earlier, that Black women are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth, that's a really, really devastating statistic. And in fact, when you look at the Chicago Department of Health report, you will find that those statistics are actually higher in Chicago, that Black women are actually 6 times more likely to die during childbirth and as well as during pregnancy. And, you know, despite advancements in the United States as it relates to, the medical field and technology, we continue to have significantly higher rates of maternal and infant mortality than any other industrialized country. And, that's a travesty within itself.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a little shocking, right? I think you think today is, you think, wow, people are still dying, having babies, and babies are still dying not for some major illness, but just for the fact of going through the birth process. What are some of the causes of this increase or rise or disparities in health of Black mothers and babies?
Andrea, that is a great question, and I think it's multifaceted. One of the things that I have begun to look at are 2 main causes, and the first is more socially acceptable, and there are biological reasons why we tend to look at things from this particular perspective. And it's looking at things through the lens of race. And, through this particular lens, we see that certain groups may be more susceptible and have predispositions to certain health conditions, or higher risk of diseases and maternal and infant death. And those diseases are things such as undiagnosed or diagnosed preeclampsia, high blood pressure, or even some pregnancy-related complications that tend to develop in women of color, whether it's embolisms or hemorrhaging. And that is one perspective. And again, that's the perspective when we look at it through the lens of race that's more socially acceptable. But I would like to dive into another another perspective that's a little bit more controversial, and it's a sociological perspective, and it's looking at the maternal and infant health crisis through the lens of racism. And unfortunately, when we consider that these incidents that are happening, that we're seeing in these reports in the Chicagoland area, we have to actually acknowledge the impact that racism is having on maternal and infant health. We have to look at structural racism. We have to begin to look at how the institutionalization of our healthcare system and how that has impacted women of color in disproportionate numbers are really influencing what we're seeing today.
Right, and I think some of that goes to some of the issues Black women have had and not being taken seriously by medical providers. I think it was Serena Williams who had a serious issue in her delivery and was raising it with her doctors, and they weren't paying attention until it almost got very challenging. So you think, if they're not listening to Serena Williams, imagine what the average citizen faces. So let's talk a little bit about Start Early. What does Start Early do, and how do you engage in this process, and how are you working to help address some of these issues that you've just talked about?
Absolutely. So Start Early is a non-for-profit organization. We have both public and private partnerships, and we've been in existence for well over 40 years. So we're an organization with very deep roots. We actually started on the south side of Chicago, servicing children and families, and we've expanded now to working with families in over 25 states in the field of early childhood education. And we really believe, and one of our core beliefs, I should say, is that every child deserves an opportunity to reach their best potential and their fullest potential in life. And so our mission is to really advance quality early learning before birth and extending throughout those first 5 years, because we know that the first 5 years of a child's development in terms of brain development and all across the board are the most important years.
Great. So, and what are some of the programs that you talk about deliver?
Absolutely. So Start Early, we have a lot of ways that we are addressing maternal and infant health. We have home visiting and doula services that are aimed at improving maternal and health outcomes with families who are living on the south side of Chicago and throughout Illinois. And our home visiting and doula services really provide an opportunity for parents to have a continuum of care, starting at pregnancy and continuing through labor and delivery, and then up until the first 3 years of that child's life. And so a doula is a trained professional that really works with the mom, during those 3 phases of pregnancy, childbirth, and delivery, and the first the first year of the child's life. And so they provide education. They help the mom understand what her medical options are. They help to provide access to medical care, and they really support the mom on a continuum of care throughout that child's life.
Well, I've heard about the importance of prenatal care, and some of that's what you're talking about. Why does it matter so much?
It really matters a lot, because we know that when families are not having access to prenatal care, that sometimes that really does increase the likelihood of premature births, and also it creates a higher propensity of infant death. And so when you are able to get prenatal services early within the first and second trimester, your likelihood for promoting optimum care for you and your baby really is tripled. And so we really encourage parents to come in to get services as soon as possible, get connected with the doula, be able to learn more about your child's development as well as what your body is going through. The more knowledge you have, the more power you have, not only to advocate for yourself, but to advocate for your child. You mentioned Serena Williams, and that's one of the things that we see is that this issue doesn't just impact women of color who are living in some of these challenging challenging circumstances, but it affects women across socioeconomic backgrounds and statuses. And Serena Williams, one of the most prominent Black athletes of our time, and then we actually had a athlete to lose her life, and that the life of her child, a Black woman, and Tori Bowie. And when we think about this, that's why we really have to look at, what is it that's impacting, our system, because these were treatable conditions.
Preventable, right. So, Mary, unfortunately, we are just about out of time, but if people are interested in getting support from Start Early or engaging, how do they find you?
We encourage anyone who is interested in services at Start Early, whether it's home visiting or doula services, please log on to www.startearly.org, and you can find out more about all of our programs.
Terrific. Wow, you've been so informative today. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your doing this really important work to help Black mothers and babies grow and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back with this week's Roundtable. Thank you.
Joining me on the next episode of Every Day is a Yay is Nuriel.
No, I was never afraid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where's that come from?
I don't know, to be honest.
Wow.
I think it was just just keep learning and money will come.
Period. Join the conversation Thursdays at 7:30 p.m. on CanTV Cable Channel 19 and streaming on cantv.org and the CanTV Plus app. Experience the power of community television.
Someone once said, tipping should never be seen as an obligation, but rather an opportunity to reward excellent service. Well, it looks like the reward system in Chicago may be about to change. Now that the City Council has done away with the subminimum wage, there are a lot of questions about what's going to happen to both the hospitality industry and the practice of tipping. Here to talk more about all the changes and what may happen next are today's roundtable panelists, Talia Soglin, a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and Ashok Selvam, editor at the Eater Chicago. Talia and Ashok, thank you for being here. Happy to have you. So, first let's just level set with my audience. When we use the term subminimum wage, what exactly does that mean? It means probably lower than the minimum wage, but can you talk about how it applies in the restaurant industry? Talia, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so it means that in Illinois and in most other US states, there's a different subminimum wage for tipped workers. So in Chicago, it's $9.48 currently, versus the full minimum wage for large employers is $15.80. And essentially the idea is that tipped workers will get tips on top of that wage. If their tips don't make up to the full minimum wage, the restaurants are supposed to fill in the gap. But now the City Council has voted to phase that out over 5 years. And so by 2028, we'll see tipped workers making the same full minimum wage as everyone else.
Okay, so why? What's the big deal? Ashok?
Well, that explanation was great, but it also kind of forgets that the tip minimum wage was kind of like a tax break for restaurant owners. So they didn't have to pay their workers that $15.80 in Chicago. In other states, Indiana, for example, it's the tip minimum wage is around $2. So it's a little bit more livable, and I put that in air quotes, in Chicago, but it doesn't keep up with the rate of inflation. And it's a city as expensive as Chicago, you're asking that particularly worker set that they're gonna, on days they're not gonna make more. Now, in theory, restaurant owners are supposed to make up the difference on slow nights, but that it doesn't always happen. And there's a national group called One Fair Wage. It's kind of like doing a barnstorming tour, going through all of the country. And they want to, their focus is not necessarily on Chicago, where the tip minimum wage is higher than the national average, the federal tip minimum wage, but they want eventually to make this a federal mandate. And if, Chicago, the birthplace of labor, isn't on board, it sure doesn't make their campaign worth a lot.
So that's where the push here in Chicago started with this group, One Fair Wage?
Yeah, and it was like winning a lottery when Mayor Johnson defeated Paul Vallis, and we had that runoff, and it just opened the door wide open. They tried with Mayor Lightfoot, And with most, tax increases, any municipality, it doesn't always work the first time. And just with the pandemic and a different set of rules and different just kind of empathy toward restaurant workers that we're dealing with a lot, One Fair Wage saw that opportunity and they took it.
Right. So I think it makes sense. I think some people think, restaurant workers, their tips are, people tip large, and so they get an opportunity to make even more than a minimum wage, but that doesn't often, sounds like it often doesn't always happen. Is that what you're seeing when you talk to workers, Talia?
There's a big wide range of restaurant workers, tipped workers, bartenders. But that is one of the things that advocates have said for a long time is, it's one thing maybe if you're working at a steakhouse downtown and you can sometimes make $75, $100 an hour in tips, versus if you're working somewhere where you're maybe not even making up to the full minimum wage and maybe your management isn't compensating you in the way they're legally required to. I've also spoken with restaurant workers who have said, I can make good money, but I know people who are working in places where they do make good money, but their management, they're not necessarily upfront with how much is coming in. They don't know if they're getting tipped out exactly what they're supposed to be being tipped out of the tip pool. And so I spoke to one bartender who was in that position and said, for that reason, even though it could impact my tips, I'm supportive of the legislation because it could help alleviate some of this kind of shady, opaque stuff that happens in the industry.
Right. And that would be where places where the tips are pooled?
Or places just in general where management isn't, being upfront, whether that is, people who are not being made up to the full minimum wage or, are just not sure because of how tipping works, whether they're being paid out what they owed. Yeah.
That's actually a great question. How does it work? Is it when you tip and you hand it to the waiter or waitress, are they getting it? Do they get to keep that, what you hand them? Or does it have to go into a pool for all the workers who don't necessarily, because I think the subminimum wage doesn't apply just to waiters and waitresses, right? It's all
baristas, bartenders.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really depends on what type of establishment. The bigger groups, they have everything, or it's all handled by payroll companies. That's all like digitized. They can instantly, you'll see the payout. That's a lot of transparency for workers. But there are several, I don't know several, but there are definitely occurrences of where workers don't have that level of transparency and they don't know where their tips are going. And that's this might be a whole other episode, but we talk about the service fees, and we don't know where those service fees are going. Are they going for healthcare? Are they going for higher wages? It's a real mystery.
Right. Wow, that's a really great point. It's a new thing, right, on the bills now for restaurants to put on the service fee, just charge it right there. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm an idiot, because I just assume, well, that's going to go to the workers, but that's not necessarily always the case. Is that what you're seeing? Sometimes it's unclear in some places, let's put it that way.
We're in the great age of there's so much information available to us, but there's so much misinformation. And during that city council meeting where they approved the abolishment of tip minimum wage, there were at least 2 aldermen that said, the general public doesn't know about tipping. They don't know where that money goes. They don't know restaurant economics about thin margins. So at the start of the show, you mentioned that tipping is a way to reward workers. Well, that is still a case, but it's also, over the last several decades, it's how they can actually survive. And those tips aren't just luxury items. That's the basis for a city like Chicago.
Right. I mean, that tends to be, that's such a great argument for why you need to eliminate that wage, because the truth is it's not about rewarding service. Everybody, at least the argument is there should be a fair base, right, for everybody. The challenge is now, I have worked and I do work with a lot of small businesses, and I know that there was, real concern in that community around, and this, the restaurant industry is very low, it's a very tight margin space. So you increase you increase the cost on the wage side, and already they've got increased inflation on food and costs, and they're very worried about how that's going to impact their business. Any thoughts there from either of you about how that should be a concern about what we're going to do to our small business community?
It's definitely a concern, and that has definitely been, the messaging from the Restaurant Association that, maybe this is fine for the big groups, but your little neighborhood restaurants can't do this. It's the Restaurant Association has surveyed Chicago restaurant owners, and it was about 80% said we will likely increase prices because of this. Restaurant owners have also thrown out maybe we'll cut labor, hire fewer people, move to more quick service models. I think it'll be really interesting to see now that the vote has happened, what will actually occur. I think another kind of underexplored aspect of this is that this is happening over 5 years. Right. So it's not all happening at once, and it may be these kind of smaller changes that are harder, for people to identify, because at the same time as maybe a restaurant is raising prices a little bit to cover this, they're also experiencing regular inflation, regular increases to the minimum wage. And so I think it may be harder for people to sort out, harder than people thought it would be to sort out exactly what that impact might be.
Yeah. Ashok, thoughts on?
Well, I think your favorite restaurant is not going to see drastic changes. What we're going to see is the new restaurants kind of opt for these new models, whether it's using QR codes, and instead of having the traditional server, we're going to have food runners. So those interactions aren't going to be as apparent. But I just spoke with the CEO of Gibson's, the big Gold Coast steakhouse, Steve Lombardo, and I said, "You're opening a new restaurant, Fulton Market. Are we going to see QR codes?" And he paused, and he kind of laughed, and he said, "That's not what we can do. That people have a level of expectation for Gibson's, and they're not going to change that, and they're just going to have to figure this out."
Right. And I think, it's a really great question about kind of the hospitality industry as a whole, right, or fact. Right? Some people go to casual restaurants, they don't care. They don't mind the QR codes. Some people go, they want to have a waiter or waitress that's engaging them and talking to them. So I think, in the long run, you think good, bad, impact overall and changing the models, or you think we should be worried about the impact this could have?
I think it's a really interesting question. Had they gone with the 2-year, would it be more dramatic than had they gone with the 5-year? I think it's likely that for some restaurant workers, it will be a larger impact than for others, just because there's such a range in the types of restaurant or tipped jobs that people have. If you're, again, kind of going back to a high-end server where you're making a ton of money in tips versus if you're somewhere where, you're at a dive bar and you're being tipped in cash, that kind of thing. So I think that the impacts will be different across the industry, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, we're likely going to see this on the county level. So Tony Prankwinkle is probably going to move on this, and we're going to see Governor Pritzker also move on this. Just last week, the state of Michigan voted to put a ballot measure in 2024 in November about this. So we're going to see this happen more and more. For the Chicagoan, we're going to see more service fees. We're going to see higher cost of food. But I'll kind of flip this around. You kind of see some servers sometimes treat certain customers better than others because there's the kind of the assumption that, well, they have more to tip.
Right.
Well, maybe this is a step where the customer can get equal service and is treated equally.
I think there's a lot to be said about leveling the playing field and just saying this is what the salary's going to be, and anything else on top of that really is earned a payout, and then people aren't worrying about just making enough money to get by. But we already, one other question I had was, we already have a little bit of a challenge, at least some of the business owners I talked to have a challenge finding workers. There's still a supply side. It's getting better, I think, but I think it's still a challenge. Is this going to help or have no real impact, you think? I know you talk to a lot of restaurant owners.
Well,
Ashok.
In current events right now, we have the migrant crisis,
Right.
and the Restaurant Association is trying to figure out how to properly credential them with the working papers, and if that's going to be a solution. I'm not so sure. I think that, we definitely see a lot of elected officials that are on board. Whether that's a possibility, it's can't tell.
Right.
The work, maybe the labor crisis will swing. The restaurant industry is the number one, sector of all departments. That's the most jobs. So we'll see seasonal workers. That'll fluctuate. That'll continue. But yeah, are some folks have to gonna become more comfortable ordering with their phone? Perhaps.
Right. or waiting. I mean, I've had a couple times where I've been places that I normally, it's not a big deal, and you're waiting, and they're like, well, somebody called in sick. You're like, one person calls in sick, and all of a sudden the kitchen's in disarray, and I think that's what put some pressure on it. So maybe better wages, maybe finding a broader workforce with some of the migrants that are coming to the city. That would be really terrific to see. But I think mostly you're right. 5 years is a long time to kind of put in this change. It's not like something anybody's going to have to face overnight. So you think it would give everybody time to adjust. I hope that's what we'll see. We have a really vibrant and flexible hospitality community here. Best argument you've heard in support and strongest argument you've heard against, Talia, and then I'll ask you, Ashok.
I would say, some of the best arguments I've heard in favor, would be, and I've heard this from, restaurant owners and also from restaurant workers, that when people are working for tips, they're getting a portion of their wages that they need to live, not something, extra on top from a customer. So they're working for the customer instead of working for the house. Mm-hmm. From a business perspective, that argument, against that is that you want your worker to be working for you and everyone being on the same team and not being incentivized to, get someone to give you in particular a little extra that may not be in the best interest of the restaurant. From the worker's perspective, the argument is that you could face harassment, racial biases in tipping. And so I think that's, probably the best argument in favor that comes from both the restaurant owners and the workers. I think some of the concerns, about restaurants raising about cutting labor, I think, that's a concern both from a diner's perspective in terms of the restaurant experience, and then also from, a concern that I've heard from people in the industry, like, will they get fewer hours? Will they start cutting people? And so I think that's something that we should also be paying attention to.
Ashok, best in support and best concern we should be worried about.
So a couple owners, we talked about downtown steakhouses. I saw a payout sheet from a restaurant in Pilsen, and a couple of the bartenders were making six figures, including tips.
Wow.
And that isn't commonplace, but it's not unique. Right. So the argument is other towns, other municipalities, including a lot of red states, they need this. Chicago does not. And the best intention, it just, I think a really interesting argument was Alderman Lee, who represents Chinatown. She voted against this and talked to a lot of restaurants in that very restaurant-based sector. So that was a really good argument against, and for the whole kind of concept of being served upon. It does have racial undertones. And maybe those jobs don't necessarily need to exist.
Right. Wow. Thank you very much. We are out of time. Really appreciate both your insights. And next time we'll talk about your favorite restaurants. Thank you for being here. I'll be right back with my final thought.
Hi, I'm Channing Leonard, guest hosting for Darius Hillman. Joining me on the next edition of In the Arena, photographer and art collector Patrick McCoy.
So most people think, you went all the way to the ends of the earth to get all this artwork, like 1,400 pieces in my house. But the important thing is that 90% of it I got from Chicago.
Join the conversation Tuesday at 7 p.m. on CAN-TV Cable Channel 19 and streaming on cantv.org and the CAN-TV Plus app. Experience the power of community television.
The parties on both sides of the sub-minimum wage discussion have raised important concerns. And on this issue, as on many others, balance is key. We have to find a way to balance the concern of businesses who need sustainable operating models to make money and keep their doors open with the needs of workers who want to be able to support themselves and their families after doing an honest day's work. While still early to see the full impact of the reforms on the many businesses, large and small, that make up our hospitality industry, we continue to hope that a move to a more equitable wage system for our restaurant workers will prove better for us all. Thanks for joining the conversation. Until next time, stay well and well informed.